Welcome to part 2, where we ask the question, what does culture do? And we're going to start off by looking at organizations and wonder if they have a uniform culture that goes through the entire organization. The answer is typically yes and no. There's typically a dominant culture that does permeate through the entire organization. It's typically the core values of the organization, what gives it its own distinct personality as a business. But often subcultures will develop. They're typically centered around different groups, perhaps departments, that have a more detailed focus on a certain function. An example can be, say, an accounting or bookkeeping department in an organization, where the employees are typically inside the office day after day working with one another, focused on the tasks such accounting might have as the bookkeeping entries and the financial analysis, generating reports for management, etc., versus a sales department, where the members of that group are often outside the business. They're in a different kind of function where they're selling and trying to bring business in. They're representing the organization externally, so what clothes they wear, what they say to people, how they interact with customers plays a different role than the employees who might be in that accounting department internally and hardly ever see a customer. So those differences can really result in subcultures that grow up within those different groups. However, permeating all of them should be that dominant culture where the core values of the organization carry through, give it that organizational flavor that everybody recognizes and believes in. So this really leads us to an understanding of that iceberg metaphor. So there's that visible part of the organization, that portion of the iceberg that sticks above the waterline, things that we can see, such as the organizational chart that shows us the structure of who reports to whom and what relationships there are between groups. The different titles people have and their position descriptions, and that certainly guides the formal authority who makes decisions and tells people who does what, etc. The objectives of the company, the posted policies, the info systems and how information is transferred, all of these kinds of things we can readily see are part of that visible part of the organization to help us understand the culture. But there's a big chunk underneath that waterline that's hidden. A lot of it's unsaid, that a new employee joining a group learns over time. That's not how we do things here, kind of feedback that that new worker might get. Who has the real hidden power and influence with the organization, the individual views people might have within groups or groups have about one another, all those interpersonal relationships and the norms that they develop with working one another, issues around trust and risk. So there's a lot built into this and how we feel and our emotions about where we work and the people we work with and the company we work for. So this metaphor of culture has these visible things we've been talking about, but don't lose sight of the very powerful, hidden, and under the water level, if you will, aspects of culture. So the culture, with those hidden as well as visible aspects, ends up doing a lot for us. It certainly defines the boundaries, how far we go, how much we interact with one another. It gives that sense of identity. I belong to this group, yet I belong to the larger organization. And it helps to foster my commitment because I can understand my place in the organization and the place of others, of what they do and how they contribute versus what I do and how I contribute. And so the whole totality of that ends up in a stability of our social system that we've built of working with one another. It gives us that idea of sense-making of what I do and what others do and how we can control our influence in the work we do together to produce the outcome that we're supposed to do. In other words, it defines the rules of the game, both the unstated as well as the stated. So over time, all of this activity ends up developing what we call as the organizational climate. It's that mood, it's that feeling, it's that spirit of what goes on within our group, within the organization. And it's a shared perspective about that organization and our teamwork. And yes, the climate in one subgroup, like the accounting department, has to interact with the climate of another group, say sales and marketing. And they're going to notice the differences between each other, but they've got to figure out how to work together so again they can all jointly achieve the organizational goals. So it does influence who we are and how we think and behave, and it helps influence the habits that we adopt as we go to work and do our jobs. So understand that organizational cultures are not neutral in their ethical orientation, even though when the organization may not be openly talking about ethical standards. but it does guide our behaviors. It does set those norms about what's okay and what's not okay. So over time, we really developed what we call this ethical work climate, this shared concept of what's right and wrong in our workplace. And know that this is different than our individual morals. We're all going to come into an organization with our own sense of right and wrong. We're not talking about that here. We're extending beyond that to say in the work climate, how does the organization view decisions around what's right and what's wrong? So that ethical climate that we take a look at and care so much about really reflects the true values of the organization. An example of change in this dimension I can bring forward now is the recent election in the United States of a new president. Donald Trump is bringing a whole different set of business experience, business involvement, money and deals that he's done into the political environment. And so it's shaking up what that norm is about what our politicians are expected to have in that ethical work climate from the past, to now we have a business leader bringing in with a whole different view about what's right and what's wrong from an ethical perspective. So organizations can shift over time, but again, that ethical climate really drives how we're supposed to behave. And just like in the US right now, it's creating uncertainty because people are unsure what the new climate is based on the old climate. So it's a powerful influence on how people are supposed to behave with one another. It's so important that we've developed this ethical climate index where we really want to categorize and measure these ethical dimensions of the organizational culture. It really helps us to understand what's going on and describe it for others. So in that climate, there are certainly things we look at, such as the independence people have, the adherence to law, code, and the rules of the organization, the typical kinds of things you would think of when we talk about the idea of ethics. And our idea in measuring them through the climate index is to get that general sense of what's going on in the expectation, the mindset, the values of managers, employees, in the relationships with one another and with customers. So this ethical climate is a powerful influence in the culture about how people feel about what they do and how they behave and interact with one another. And certainly studies of ethical climates have produced results that are probably not unsurprising to you. We have found that the stronger the ethical climate typically, the more sensitivity, the moral to judgment, to motivation, the influence on character has, results in a stronger workplace and better organizational performance. And certainly a weak ethical climate produces more questionable outcomes, if you will. So what we're interested in as leaders of these organizations, when we look at culture, is what are the sustainability of our practices over time? How can we take these sense of ethical behaviors, the rules of working with one another together, both the written and the unwritten, to become deeply embedded in something our employees follow over time? So we're looking for that sustainability in our social practices with one another. We don't have to be perfect in what we do here. It's not about being purely altruistic, certainly. We realize people come to work to earn a paycheck, to provide a life for themselves, and they have other goals as well as the organizational goals. But it's about holding together that social framework of treating one another well and creating an ethical climate where we want to believe in and can follow the company guides and rules so we can develop that long-term sense of well-being for one another. So we have to recognize, like other cultural practice, building the sustainability of these belief sets, these behaviors to one another takes time and nurturing to really become effective over a long term. So in terms of thinking of culture and an organization that might want to become innovative, it's realizing that the culture may have to be developed in a different way to change that organizational climate, to maybe hold true to the ethical climate we have while at the same time shifting some of the other behaviors. So innovative companies typically will push for a more open, unconventional, collaborative kind of climate where visions and innovative thinking to be different, to think outside of the box kind of concept becomes the mainstay. It's saying we've got rules to guide us and certainly ethical standards, but if we're really interested in innovation, we've got to take off the shackles of employees and let them be daring, let them do something a little bit differently. So again, it takes a culture, a long-term kind of shift of management to get employees to recognize those changes might be underway and get them to behave a little bit differently. Certainly new firms, startup businesses are typically very innovative. They're trying to get their footing into the marketplace. They're trying to become established. So they want to be agile. They want to be able to react quickly to customer demands, to competitive forces. And so building a culture that's innovative usually really calls for that kind of openness and that cultural acceptance to, yeah, take a risk, try something. Let's see how this works as we go forward. So it can become a definite asset for the organization. Having a culture that we understand, that really holds the glue together of what we do and how we behave, can become a strength for an organization. For a while, I worked for a telecommunications company, a very large company in the United States, where the culture really encouraged family members to encourage other family members to come and join the organization. That in some companies where you could never have a son or daughter working for a parent or a grandparent, in this company, that was strongly encouraged. It was a public corporation with shareholders who cared about its performance, so there was a lot of oversight, a lot of openness about what was going on. So it wasn't a case of nepotism where people were lining their pockets by having family members come in. It was a culture they built around sustainability, of having family members who knew other family members were there and they cared about each other's success and performance. It built a sense of community, and that asset became a strength to the organization. That there would be work groups. The person with the youngest seniority had 28 years experience. I mean, think of the kind of organizational climate that created. Wow, there was a strength, there was a long-term sense of working there, of wanting to be together, be a family, and committed to that organization.